The door slammed so hard the windows shuddered. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Jonah's small fingers clutched at Annie Mae Coulter's coat, and Eli's jaw locked tight, like he was trying to swallow a scream. Only Micah whispered Mama, barely a thread of sound, against the wind howling down Main Street. Mrs. Prue, the boarding house keeper, stood framed in the yellow light, her apron starched so stiff it might as well have been armor. Her mouth curled into a hard, tight smile. "No rooms for your kind, Mrs. Coulter. I told you already." Annie's voice came out low, steady, the way you speak to a wild horse about to bolt. "Just one night. It's freezing out here." Mrs. Prue's eyes flicked to the three boys like they were stray dogs that had followed her in from the dump. "And tomorrow? What then? I've got a reputation, and you've got no husband. Bad for business." The snow whipped down the street, fat and heavy, stinging Annie's face like small stones. Her hands burned from gripping Jonah's shoulders too long. Her coat was thin. It had belonged to her husband before the mine caved in. "They'll freeze," she said softly. Mrs. Prue reached for the door. "Should have thought of that before your man went underground." "Good evening." Then the lock clicked final as a coffin lid. The wind roared through the street, lifting Annie's skirt and lashing it against her legs. The boys stood like fence posts in the cold, small, stiff, silent. Eli, the oldest, was already trying to look like a man. But he was 12. His ears were red. His boots are too thin. Jonah was 5, shivering so hard she could feel it through her coat. Micah's lips trembled, but he said nothing. Behind the closed door, a warm lamplight glowed. From other houses, too. Windows like square suns filled with people who had food and heat and didn't want to see her. She could almost hear their whispers, even though the street was empty. "Widow woman. 3 mouths to feed. Bad luck." She swallowed the bitterness hard. "People don't see you when you're broken. They look right through you." Ma, Eli said, voice cracking from cold and anger. "What do we do?" She turned toward the wagon hitched at the post, everything they owned piled high under a tattered canvas. The horse's ribs showed breath fogging in the icy air. Her fingers ached as she took the reins. There was no plan, not really. Only what came next. "We ride," she said. "Ride where Micah whispered." "Somewhere the wind won't take us," she lied. They climbed onto the wagon. Eli helped Jonah up without a word. Snow fell heavier now, thick enough to swallow the sound of the wheels as they creaked away from the glow of Ash Hollow's windows. No one came out. No one stopped them. The main street faded behind them, just a long row of yellow eyes watching in silence. The road out of town twisted like a frozen river through low pines. The sky was already black, the storm gathering fast. Wind howled between the trees like something alive. Eli hunched forward beside her, his breath a pale fog. "They don't care if we die," he muttered. "Eli. It's true." He turned to her. "They'd rather we froze than take us in." She had no answer. He wasn't wrong. The wagon lurched as the horse stumbled on an icy rut. Jonah whimpered. Annie wrapped her arm around him, pressing his face to her side to block the wind. She thought about turning back, but to what? A locked door. Pitying stares. Ahead, the mountains loomed dark shapes against a darker sky. She'd never been past that ridge. Not once. But she knew what waited. If they stayed, the cold would creep in, slowly settle into their bones, and take the smallest first. She tightened her grip on the reins. "We'll camp past the ridge. We'll make it." The snow fell so thick now she could barely see 10 feet ahead. The horse's ears twitched nervously. A branch cracked somewhere off the trail. Eli twisted, peering into the dark. "Ma, someone's out there." Her hand went instinctively to the old rifle beneath the seat, a relic from her husband. She felt the cold metal through her glove. Her heart banged hard against her ribs. "Could be a coyote," she said, but her voice didn't sound sure. "No coyote rides a horse," Eli whispered. And then she saw it, just a shadow at first, perched on the ridge above the trail. A horse and a rider motionless. Snow fell around them, clinging to their outline like frost on a grave. The figure didn't move, didn't call out, just watched. Annie pulled the wagon to a halt. The horse snorted, nervous. Jonah started to cry, a soft whimper muffled by the wind. The rider nudged his horse down the ridge with slow, deliberate movements. Not threatening, not friendly either. When he came close enough, Annie could make out a long coat lined with fur snow on the brim of his hat, a face half hidden by a beard. A mountain man. "The trail you're on goes nowhere," he said, voice low and steady. "Storm'll kill you 'fore midnight." Annie's fingers stayed on the rifle. "We'll manage." His eyes flicked to Jonah clinging to her side, then to Eli's shaking hands. "No, you won't." He turned his horse without another word, as if assuming she'd follow. Eli leaned close. "Ma, what do we do?" She didn't trust him. I didn't trust anyone anymore. But she also knew the trail ahead was a death sentence. Jonah's teeth were already chattering so hard it shook his whole body. She clicked her tongue softly and snapped the reins. The wagon rolled after him. The cabin came into view 20 minutes later, a squat shape of rough-hewn logs tucked between black pines. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, glowing gold through the snow. A barn hunched nearby, half buried under drifts. And behind it, Annie saw it even through the swirling white, a single grave marker. Wood. Weathered. Learning. The man dismounted and opened the door without ceremony. Warm light spilled out, catching on the snow like fire. "Inside," he said. "All of you." The boys didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled down from the wagon, stumbling toward the heat. Annie hesitated at the threshold. She'd spent too many nights learning that safety wasn't always safe. He glanced back at her, unreadable. "I didn't invite you because I'm kind. I invited you because I remember what cold can take." She stepped inside. The warmth hit like a fist, so sudden it burned. Jonah collapsed near the hearth, Micah curling beside him. Eli stayed standing, chin up, still suspicious, but thawing fast. The man pulled a heavy canvas from a peg and strung it across the room, dividing the space into two halves with practiced efficiency. "Boys, stay by the fire," he said. "You take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn." Annie stiffened. "We won't take charity." His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, didn't flinch. "Then call it a trade. You cook. I'll pretend it ain't charity, so my pride stays intact." He walked back into the storm before she could answer. Through the frosted window, she watched him lead the exhausted horse toward the barn. He stopped briefly at the grave marker, snow gathering on his shoulders, hat in hand. He stood there a long time. Later, as the boys slept, Annie sat near the fire, staring at the wooden grave through the window pane. The flames crackled softly. Outside, the storm screamed against the mountains. Inside, the heat wrapped around her like something she wasn't sure she deserved. Eli stirred in the bedroll. "Who is he?" "I don't know," she whispered. She tightened the blanket around Jonah's small body. A stranger, a storm, a grave in the snow. She didn't know if they'd found refuge or something worse. Outside in the black forest, the wind howled through the trees. Somewhere beyond the firelight, a mountain man stood alone in the barn, listening to the storm and to ghosts only he could hear. The barn smelled of cedar and ash, and something older like memory soaked into the beams. Luther Barrage hung the bridle on a rusted nail, wiped the horse's muzzle, and ran a palm down her trembling flank. "You done good, girl," he muttered, voice low and scratchy from disuse. "The storm's not your fault." He leaned his forehead to hers for a moment, eyes closed. When he turned back toward the cabin, snow was already piling on his shoulders. The grave behind the barn was nearly buried now. He didn't stop this time, just tipped his hat toward it and walked away. Inside the cabin had gone quiet. Firelight flickered behind the canvas he'd strung across the room. Through the divider, he could see outlines, 3 boys curled like puppies near the hearth, and her. Annie Mae, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the bed, back straight, head bowed, like she was listening for something no one else could hear. He cleared his throat. She looked up. "Your horse is done for if we hadn't stopped. She needs rest. Warm oats if you've got any." He nodded, gestured toward a barrel near the door. "Mix them with water. Save the dry for the morning." She crossed it silently. Her movements were sharp but tired, like someone who'd been running on fumes for a long time. Her hands were red from the cold, cracked in the knuckles. "I can boil snow," she said. "There's a spring out back under the pine. Still runs in winter. Hasn't frozen yet." She gave a slight nod, then crouched near the fire and began to boil water in an old iron pot. She moved like she'd done this before, like she'd done everything before. "You've got enough for the boys?" he asked. Her shoulders lifted once. "We'll make it stretch." He opened a cupboard and tossed her a burlap sack. "Beans. Cured meat's in the box behind you. Ain't fresh, but it'll hold." She didn't say thank you, but her fingers trembled as she opened the sack. Luther removed his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. Snow melted off it in long, slow drips. He walked to the far end of the cabin, gathered some pelts, and made a nest for himself near the barn door. "You don't have to sleep out there," she said after a beat. "There's room enough in here." He looked at her, then full on. Her face was weathered from hard years. Not aged cheekbones, hollowed eyes rimmed red, but her jaw was set. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering decency. He shook his head. "I don't sleep near folks. Not anymore." She studied him for a moment. "Suit yourself." They lapsed into silence again, the fire popping between them like a referee. Behind the curtain, the youngest boy stirred and murmured something about cookies. Luther let out a breath. It's been a long time since laughter lived in this place. She glanced toward the boys. Kids don't stop needing, even when the world says no. He looked away. After a long while, she spoke again. "You live out here alone." "3 winters now. No neighbors. Closest one's a trapper 10 miles south. I don't like people. Never did. But you helped us," he shrugged. "Didn't do it for you." That hung in the air between them, stiff and strange. She let it lie, then went back to stirring the pot. The smell of beans and salt pork began to rise. It filled the cabin with something he hadn't felt in a while. Familiarity. Home if he were the kind of man who believed in such things. Jonah shuffled out from behind the curtain, then hair sticking up, dragging a blanket behind him. His thumb was halfway to his mouth before he remembered he was too old for that. Luther knelt to his level. "You hungry little man." The boy nodded shyly. Luther reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden bear, hand-carved, edges rough. Ain't much, but he's got a strong back and good paws. Keep watch at night. Jonah's eyes lit up. Is he magic? Only if you believe he is. The boy hugged the bear tight and toddled back to the fire. Annie was watching him again. You have children, Luther stood slowly, his eyes darkened, voice barely a whisper. I had a son once. She didn't ask more, just ladled stew into 4 chipped bowls and handed them out. When the other boys stirred, she kissed their foreheads and pressed the warm bowls into their hands without a word. They ate like they hadn't seen a meal in days. Probably hadn't. Luther ate last, sitting against the far wall, watching, listening, trying not to feel the cracks forming in his defenses. An hour passed like that, slow, silent warm. Then Jonah fell asleep again, curled beside his brothers like a fox kit. Annie stood and looked around. The place was dusty but well built, sparse but cared for. Have you ever thought about fixing this place up? She asked. He raised an eyebrow. Didn't see the need. She picked up a broom from the corner and started sweeping without asking. Well, now you've got boots tracking in snow and boys poking at things. Looks like I need to find you. He huffed a laugh, surprised by it. As she cleaned, he watched her move, practical, efficient, a woman used to doing too much with too little. She swept like it mattered. Like dignity came in bristles and motion. He found himself saying, I didn't invite you because I'm kind. I invited you because I remember what cold can take. She paused, rested both hands on the broom handle. I know. Then she kept sweeping. Outside, the wind had died down to a low whisper through the trees. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring with what's missing. When she finished, she folded the blanket over the boys and stepped outside to check on the horse. Luther followed without a word. The moon was a dull smear behind clouds, but the worst of the storm had passed. Pines groaned under heavy snow. Everything glistened like glass. She'll make it through the night, Annie said, patting the mare's flank. He nodded. You will too. She looked at him, head tilted slightly. We don't need saving. He met her eyes. Didn't say you did. They stood like that for a moment. 2 strangers wrapped in silence, thick as wool. Then she turned back toward the cabin. Come inside. You'll catch a cold. He stayed out a few more seconds, letting the night breathe against his face. Then followed. Inside, the fire had burned low, but not out. The boys snored softly. Annie had taken the far side of the bed, still dressed, arms folded under her head. Luther lay down behind the canvas divider, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the cabin was closing in. Something else stirred in the walls now, footsteps, breath, life. Not ghosts. Life. Through the wall he heard Annie whisper to no one, or maybe to God, let us stay one more night. And for some reason, that felt like a promise. A log cracked in the fire. The wind died to a hush. Tomorrow he'd chop wood, and maybe fix that back hinge, just in case. The storm didn't leave. It settled in like a drunk uncle, loud, unwelcome, and not in a hurry to move on. By the 3rd day, snow pressed up against the cabin windows, so thick it turned daylight to a dim gray hush. Wind howled in waves, rising and falling, like a living thing circling the place, testing for cracks. Luther split more wood than the stove could burn just to stay busy. Every swing of the axe was sharper than it needed to be. His shoulders ached, his hands blistered under gloves worn too thin. But he preferred pain to thinking. Thinking made room for memory. Inside the cabin smelled like smoke beans and wet wool and life. Jonah sang nonsense songs while dragging the wooden bear across the floor. Micah tried copying words from Annie's Bible, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Eli, serious as a preacher, sat by the window with a carving knife Luther had lent him, whittling the end of a stick into something that might one day resemble a knife. Annie didn't stop moving. She mended Luther's shirts without asking, cleaned the stovepipe, and made stew from next to nothing. She swept organized, stacked, boiled, stitched, and taught like stillness might crack her wide open. Luther watched from the porch once the canvas curtain pulled just enough to see without being seen. She was teaching the boys how to sound out letters. Her finger traced under the words like she was tracing a path she knew by heart. He'd never seen anything like it. S-H-E-P-H-E-R-D, she said aloud, tapping the page. What's that shepherd Micah said? And what does a shepherd do? Protect sheep, Jonah answered from the floor, not even looking up. She smiled. That's right. She looked tired, but it was a different kind of tired than when she'd first arrived. Not survival tired, not grief tired, just the kind that came from doing everything and still feeling like it wasn't enough. Luther stepped back from the curtain. A fire can warm you or burn you, depends who's holding the match. He wasn't sure which one he was. Later he came inside just long enough to see her rummaging through his shelves. She was trying to find flour. There's none left, he said quietly. She didn't look up. I figured. I was hoping you were the kind of man who hides things behind other things. I ain't that clever or that dumb, she muttered. She stood wiping her hands on her skirt. We've got 2 days' worth of beans left. Maybe less. I've trapped some rabbits before. Could check the snares. She nodded. I'll stretch what's here. He didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't asking him to fix it. She wasn't even complaining. She was just stating a fact and bracing herself to meet it head on. He wanted to offer something more, but nothing came out. That night, as the boys slept, Annie sat by the fire with her sewing again. Luther sat across the room carving something slowly, like a horse maybe, but it looked more like a mule with ideas. You always whittle in silence, she asked without looking up. I usually don't have company. She made a sound, something between a laugh and a sigh. You'd never guess this place would be the first time my boys felt safe in months. He glanced at her. You don't feel safe? She looked at him then, needle paused in midair. I don't feel anything yet. Just trying not to fall apart. The fire cracked, sending a pop of sparks up the chimney. You want me to tell you it gets easier? He asked. No, she said, soft but firm. I want you to tell me the truth. Luther put the carving down. His hands were shaking. It doesn't get easier. You just get used to the ache. You wear it like a coat. You sleep under it. Some days it's lighter. Some days it chokes you. She nodded. That sounds about right. He looked over at the canvas divider. They seem to sleep easy. I keep them busy enough. If they're too tired to think, they don't ask about their father. You tell them what happened. I told them the roof caved in, that he didn't suffer. It was fast. And the truth. She blinked. The shaft held for 3 hours. He was alive for most of it. Luther winced. Damn. They were pulling bodies out for days. I waited. I cooked. I cleaned his clothes and folded his boots by the door, like he'd just walk in. I did the same, he whispered. Annie looked at him. Her eyes weren't wet, but something behind them shimmered like heat off desert rock. Your wife, he nodded. Wife and son. Fever hit hard. I left in the middle of a blizzard to find the doctor. It took too long. By the time I got back, he stopped, swallowed. I buried them both that night. Annie didn't speak for a long while, just stared into the fire like it held the answers neither of them could say out loud. "You don't talk to people much, do you?" she finally asked. "No reason to." "Well, I'm not much of a preacher, but I can tell you this, if you stay silent too long, you start thinking maybe your voice doesn't matter." Luther looked up. She said it like she wasn't just talking to him. "I talk to the grave sometimes," he admitted. "That's a start." The wind picked up again, rattling the windows. Annie stood and stretched her back, cracking softly. "We need to clean the hearth tomorrow. That soot's building up. I'll do it. You know how I know enough not to let the house burn down." "That's encouraging." He gave a half smile. She paused at the divider, then looked back. "The carving. What is it, horse?" "Maybe. The jury's still out. Mind if Jonah sees it when you're done, made it for him." She stared at him a beat longer than necessary, then disappeared behind the canvas. Luther sat back in his chair, let the silence settle around him. He hadn't meant to open up. It had just spilled out quiet as snow, sudden as memory. Maybe that's what happened when people filled the cabin again. You either shut the door or let the heat in. He got up, fed the fire another log, then glanced toward the corner where his old coat still hung. Inside the pocket was a gold band tucked away for 3 winters. He hadn't touched it since the night he buried them. His hand didn't move toward it now, but he thought about it. Outside, the storm had quieted to a low murmur. Inside, he sat near the fire until sleep took him, not the kind of sleep that chased pain away, but the kind that kept the cold from getting in. Tomorrow, they'd find the snares, maybe catch a rabbit, maybe not. But the cabin felt different now, alive. And for the first time in 3 winters, Luther didn't dread the morning. He just hoped it came with less snow. The snow had stopped falling sometime before dawn. Annie Mae stepped outside, wrapped in Luther's second coat, too big in the shoulders, frayed at the cuffs, but warmer than anything she owned. The cold bit at her skin in that quiet way mountain cold does. No storm left, just silence so still it rang in her ears. The yard was thick with untouched snow, blanketing everything in a way that made it feel like the world had been reset. The sky was washed pale blue sun, peeking low through trees. Steam curled from the cabin chimney, and the only sound was the soft creak of the barn's old weather vane turning in the breeze. She walked carefully toward the barn boots, crunching a clean trail. She hadn't slept much. Dreams twisted around her mind, like barbed wire flashes of her husband, trapped in the mine her boys buried beneath snow, and Luther's carved horse floating in firelight, like some kind of silent promise. Halfway to the barn, she saw it. The grave. Not hidden, not marked in secrecy. Just there. A wooden cross. Simple. Weathered. Tilting slightly with age. Snow piled gently around it like someone had shoveled it clean not long ago. 2 names were etched into the plank, carved by hand. Eleanor Berridge, Daniel Berridge, 1879. 3 years gone. A wife, a son. She stood staring at the names for a long while, arms folded tight against the cold. Her breath fogged in the morning air. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. She didn't turn. Luther's voice came quiet and rough. "I buried them the same day." Annie didn't speak. He stepped closer, boots thudding softly behind her. Fever came fast. Took her first. Took him a few hours later. She looked down. You carved the names yourself. He nodded. Didn't have a preacher, just me and a shovel. Annie knelt beside the grave and brushed snow off the base. The letters were uneven, worn at the edges, but still there, still legible. They mattered, she said, more to herself than him. They did. I'm sorry. He exhaled through his nose. I didn't bring you out here to make you sorry. Why did you? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice cracked low. To remind myself it happened. Some mornings I wake up and forget, and some mornings I wish I could. They stood in silence again. Then from the trees beyond the barn, a voice called out, dry as pine needles and sharp as flint. Are you still talking to ghosts, Luther? He stiffened. Annie turned fast. A tall figure approached from the tree line wrapped in a patched buffalo coat, silver hair braided down her back. Her boots were dusted with snow, and she carried a bundle of herbs and pelts in her arms, like she'd been walking a long way without stopping once. Annie instinctively stepped between the boys inside the cabin and the woman outside, but Luther didn't flinch. Nora, he said. Didn't expect to see company, she replied, gaze sliding past him to Annie. You finally let someone in, thought I'd have to bury you beside them before that happened. Annie blinked. Nora Red Elk's eyes were piercing, unreadable. She looked half like a ghost herself, Gin, like carved sandstone posture, straight as a rifle barrel. Nora Luther said again, more a sigh than a greeting. What brings you up this way? She held up the bundle. News, roots, bitter herbs. Word was you might be dying of your own pride. Figured I'd come make sure. He grunted, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm not dying. No, she said, but something sure is. Thought I'd check before it finished the job. She walked right past him, nodding once at Annie. You the one with the boys? Annie nodded warily. They're inside. Yes, ma'am. Are you feeding them? We're doing our best. Nora didn't blink. That cabin smells like life again. I can smell it from the trees. He used to smell like whiskey and ash. Now it's soup and soap. That's you, I figure. Annie didn't answer. Good, Nora said. Keep doing it. She stepped into the barn without asking. Luther and Annie exchanged a glance. You know her well, Annie asked. Used to, he said. We kept each other company after it happened. Winters long in the mountains. Annie looked toward the barn. Is she your wife? No. He hesitated. But she might have saved me once. The boys called from inside, and Annie headed back toward the cabin. Luther lingered near the grave a moment longer, then followed. Inside, the boys were laughing. Nora sat on the floor with Jonah in her lap, showing him how to braid a length of rawhide. Micah hovered close, curious. Eli watched from a corner, quiet, but not unfriendly. Annie handed her a cup of hot tea. Thanks, Nora said. She took a sip, made a face. Too sweet, but kind. You came a long way, Annie said. I came to say one thing. She set the cup down. You're stirring ghosts in him, girl. That can be good, or it can get him killed. Annie raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Nora's voice dropped low. He carries guilt like some men carry guns. Fast to draw, slow to clean. You stir that up wrong, he'll shoot himself through the heart without pulling a trigger. Annie folded her arms. You think I don't carry ghosts too? Nora studied her for a long beat, then gave a single nod. Then maybe you know what I'm saying. Don't let his grief drown yours. You got those boys to think about." Annie looked toward the canvas curtain, where Jonah had already fallen asleep again, the braided leather clutched in his hand like a snake. "I know." Luther stepped inside, then closing the door against the wind. Nora stood. "I'll be heading out before night." The storm left the tracks fresh. "Don't want to lose the trail." "You'll stay for supper," Annie said. "It's the least we can do." Nora's expression softened. "Fine. But I'm not cleaning." "You can peel carrots," Micah piped up. "Deal," Nora said, cracking her first smile. Later that night, after the stew was gone and the boys asleep, Nora pulled her coat on and stood in the doorway. "Are you letting her stay?" she asked Luther without looking at him. He didn't answer. "Then say it. Or she'll leave and you'll talk to 3 graves instead of 2. He looked over at Annie, who stood by the hearth in silence. Nora's voice dropped to a whisper as she stepped outside. "Dead folks don't talk, but they sure do listen." And then she was gone. The knock on the door didn't sound urgent. It was too polite for that measured deliberate, like someone trying not to startle the animals. Luther knew what it was before he opened it. He'd felt it in the wind that morning, less bite, more judgment. He opened the door slowly. 2 horses stood in the yard, steaming from the climb. Their riders looked like they'd been carved out of politics and prayer. Judge Ransom Baird, slick as a polished rifle, long coat immaculate, despite the snow, sat tall in his saddle-gloved hands, folded neatly over the horn. Beside him, Pastor Levi Crowell adjusted his spectacles and gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. They didn't bother dismounting. "Mr. Barridge," the judge said, voice smooth as creek ice. "Hope we're not intruding." Luther said nothing, just stepped aside and let the door hang open like a warning. Inside, Annie stood at the stove, her back ramrod straight. She didn't turn, didn't speak, but her shoulders tensed like she'd been bracing for this all morning. "Pastor," she said evenly. "Mrs. Coulter." Pastor Crowell replied, nodding once. "We were hoping for a word." The boys were in the corner, pretending not to listen. Jonah had stopped humming mid-song. Eli's hands were clenched white in his lap. Luther stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him. The cold didn't bite, not like it had before. But the chill that hung in the air wasn't from the weather. It was the kind that lived in stares and assumptions. Baird cleared his throat. "You've always been a private man, Barridge. Folks respected that. But these are different times." Luther said nothing. The presence of a woman unwed, unchaperoned, with children staying on your land. "Well, it's raised concerns. Who's yours?" the judge said simply, "whether you know it yet or not." Pastor Crowell tried to soften the blow. "It's not judgment, brother. It's a community concern. Appearances matter, especially when children are involved." Luther looked down at his boots, then back up at their faces. "You came all the way up here for appearances." "We came," Baird said, leaning forward slightly, "because Ash Hollow has always been a town of order. And this," he gestured toward the cabin, "this doesn't sit right with that order." "She's a widow," Luther said flatly, "with nowhere else to go." "And your land has value," Baird replied smoothly. "Water rights, timber, bordering an old mining claim her husband used to hold. People talk." "What people?" The judge smiled. "Let's not play dumb. We're offering a path forward, a way to handle this properly." Luther's jaw clenched. And what would that be? Help her relocate. The county has resource shelters, orphan placements. We can ensure the boys are looked after. In return, no legal entanglements, no property disputes. Everything stays quiet. Luther didn't move. Pastor Crowell adjusted his coat. "We're not your enemy's son." "I'm not your son," Luther replied. The judge's smile turned brittle. "Well, we hope you'll consider our advice." Then he turned his horse and trotted off without waiting for a reply. The pastor hesitated a second longer, gave a small, sad nod, and followed. Luther stood in the yard until their shadows disappeared down the trail. When he stepped back inside, the warmth hit like a slap. Annie had already moved to the table folding laundry that didn't need folding. Her hands moved fast, precise, like she was sewing anger into every crease. "You should have said something," she said without looking up. "They weren't here for conversation." "No," she said. "They were here to threaten me, and you let them." Luther shut the door. "It's not that simple." She spun to face him. "It is exactly that simple. They think I'm a whore. They think you're some lonely mountain brute looking to claim a broken woman's land." "I know what they think." "Then why didn't you speak?" "I didn't know what to say." Annie laughed, a cold, bitter sound that didn't belong in her throat. "That's the problem, Luther. You keep thinking silence will protect you, but it doesn't protect me, or the boys." The canvas curtain fluttered slightly. A small sniffle echoed from behind it. Annie's voice dropped. "You brought us in. You kept us warm. You saved us. Remember? So why does it feel like you just left us on the porch again?" Luther looked at the floor, hands curled into fists. "You can freeze a woman out, or you can run her out," Annie said quietly. "Ash Hollow likes both." He looked up, stung, but she didn't shout, didn't cry. She just picked up the folded shirts, turned her back, and walked to the bedroom corner like the conversation was over. That night she didn't sit by the fire, and neither did the boys. Luther sat alone, carving useless lines into a block of wood that wouldn't become anything. The flames hissed, the shadows danced, but no warmth touched his skin. Around midnight, he walked out to the barn. Snow crunched beneath his boots. He stood by the grave, looking down at the names again. "I messed up," he whispered. "Again." No wind answered. No voice rose from the trees. He dropped to one knee and pressed his palm against the cross. "I don't know how to be better. I don't know how to fix this." The wood was cold under his hand. Steady. Still there after all these years. The cabin lights flickered behind him, dim and distant. He'd let her take the fire and go cold, just like before. And he knew this time she might not stay. The next morning came pale and slow. Annie cooked in silence. Eli gathered water. Jonah pouted quietly, unsure why the air felt heavier. Only Micah asked questions, and when Luther didn't answer them, he stopped asking. Annie packed slowly that day. A few blankets, canned goods, the last of the lard wrapped in cloth. She didn't make a speech, didn't demand anything. She just folded, quiet, precise. She didn't cry, she just moved. Luther watched her stomach rotting with guilt, hands twitching to reach for something he couldn't name. When she tied the last trunk closed, she stood in the doorway, holding the wooden horse he'd carved. "He sleeps with it," she said, "even when it's splintering." Then she placed it gently on the table and walked outside. The boys followed her without protest. Eli didn't look back. Jonah did. Micah held the door for us like a gentleman, and Luther stayed frozen inside. She hitched the horse, loaded the wagon, climbed aboard like she'd done it 1,000 times. And when they rolled away, Luther stood in the open doorway, watching the snow settle over the trail like dust over an empty grave. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't fight. He just watched. And when the wind picked up again, it whispered like a voice he'd heard once before. She won't be the last if you keep choosing silence. Snow chased them like a curse. By the time Annie found the old trapper's line shack just 5 miles north, but might as well have been 50, her hands were stiff with cold, and Jonah was crying softly under the blanket. The wind had picked up again, not like the last storm, but bitter enough to burn through the seams of her coat. The sky was closing in, gray, low, and vengeful. Eli helped unhitch the horse, the boy's jaw-tight movements sharp. Micah fumbled with the door latch, fingers red and clumsy. Inside, the shack smelled like mold and regret. Dirt floor, cracked walls, one stove with a rusted belly, and a broken leg propped on a rock. It was a shelter, but barely. Annie dropped the trunk in the corner and exhaled hard. "We'll be all right," she said, mostly for herself. Jonah sniffled. "I miss the fire." Eli didn't look at her. He took off his coat and folded it over Jonah's legs, then turned to face the wall. Annie knelt by the stove, fingers shaking as she struck a match. It took 4 tries. When the flame finally caught, she closed her eyes and whispered a word she wasn't sure was thanks or just exhaustion. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the air hung heavy with silence. Micah sat down beside her. "Are we going back?" She didn't answer. "Ma." "No," Eli said sharply. "We're not." Annie looked at him. "Eli, no." He stood now, eyes shining. "He let them say things about you. He didn't stop them. He just stood there like he wasn't even part of it. Eli, you begged for that room in Ash Hollow. You begged. And he let them treat you like trash. He let them talk like we were nothing." And then he said nothing. Annie stepped toward him, but Eli backed away, breathing hard. "You keep thinking people will be better if you're just kind enough, quiet enough, grateful enough. But they're not. They don't care. Nobody does." Jonah started to cry again. Annie moved to hush him, but Eli didn't stop. "You brought us all the way out here for what, another shack? Another night freezing while someone else stays warm and safe and silent. What was the point?" "Enough," she said softly, finally. Eli looked at her chest, heaving. He wasn't angry anymore. He was scared, and he didn't know how to carry it. "Don't expect boys to grow up right," he whispered, "if men keep disappearing." He sat down hard in the corner, pulled his knees to his chest. Annie wrapped Jonah tighter and rocked him gently. Micah stared into the stove like it might offer answers. Outside, snow started to fall again. Back at the cabin, Luther sat in the doorway, coat on axe untouched by the firewood stack. The room felt like it was shrinking. He hadn't lit a lantern. The sun had gone down hours ago, but he didn't want the light. He'd tried drinking the guilt away once. The bottle still sat in the corner unopened, dust on the cork. He didn't want that road again. But he wasn't sure what road he did want. Nora's words came back sharp as frost. "You stir that up wrong, and he'll shoot himself through the heart without pulling a trigger." Too late. The trigger had been pulled the second he stayed quiet. He got up, walked outside. The cold slapped him. He wanted it to. His boots crunched through the trail Annie had left behind. He followed it out past the barn, past the grave. Snow fell heavier now. He stopped there. I looked at the names again. Eleanor. Daniel. "I did it again," he whispered. I watched it all fall apart, and I didn't move. The wind tore at his coat. I let them go. No answer. "I let you go," silence. He sat in the snow beside the grave, didn't care that his coat was thin, didn't care that his legs were already wet. The cold settled into his bones like truth. "I'm a coward," he said aloud. Then he said it again, louder. "I'm a coward." His voice echoed across the pines. Nothing answered back. Not the trees, not the wind, not the dead. He lowered his head into his hands. Back in the shack, Annie sat with her back to the wall, legs curled under Jonah. She'd wrapped every blanket they had around the boys, layered coats over them, tucked her own body around them like armor. The fire in the stove was low, barely embers. Her lips were cracked. Her breath came shallow. She was too tired to cry. The kind of tiredness that lives in the bones. The kind that doesn't sleep, don't eat, just endures. She remembered when her husband first died how people would say, "He's in a better place now," as if that made her floor less cold, as if it fed her children. She remembered the noise when the mine collapsed, the silence afterward, and she remembered Luther's eyes when she left. Hollow, not angry, not pleading, just empty. Like all the things he wanted to say had burned up before reaching his lips. Jonah stirred in his sleep and pressed closer. She kissed the top of his head. "I won't let you be cold again," she whispered. That night, Luther didn't sleep. He sat by the grave until dawn, waiting for courage to take root. It didn't. But something else did. Resolve. He stood. His knees cracked. His back ached. But his hands were steady. He turned toward the cabin. Inside, he lit the fire, packed a bag, threw his old coat over his shoulders, reached for the ring he hadn't touched in 3 years. It sat in his palm. Heavy. Simple. He didn't put it on. He just held it. Then he crossed the cabin to the corner trunk, pulled out the land deed Nora had left years ago. 40 acres, bordering Ash Hollow. Water access. Untouched. He laid it on the table. Beside it, he placed the wooden horse Jonah had loved. And then, he saddled his mare. As the first sun bled through the trees, Luther Barrage rode down the trail, heading toward the county office. The shack was 5 miles north. If she hadn't frozen through the night, that he still had time. If not, he didn't let himself finish that thought. He kicked the horse faster. In the shack, Annie opened her eyes to sunlight. Weak, but real. The storm had broken. She pushed herself up slowly. Her limbs were stiff, her lips numb. Micah stirred. "Ma," she kissed his cheek. "We're okay," she whispered. But the dread hadn't lifted, because she didn't know where to go next. Didn't know if anyone would ever choose them without regret. She didn't know that right then Luther Barrage was walking into the county office, pulling out Nora's deed with shaking hands and saying, "I'm signing it over." To her. She didn't know the clerk would ask, "Are you sure about this?" and that he'd reply, "No, but I'm doing it anyway." In Ash Hollow, Sunday service was beginning. The church bells rang, and for the first time in years, Luther Barrage walked toward them, holding a land deed, a prayer, and something heavier than grief. He wasn't sure what to call it, but it looked a little like hope. The church doors creaked like they hadn't been opened from the outside in years. Luther Barrage stepped in boots caked with half-frozen mud coats still dusted with snow. The congregation turned as one necklace of glances swung toward him, eyes narrowing, whispers firing like dry leaves in the wind. He stood in the back for a breath longer than comfort allowed. Then he walked forward straight down the aisle like a man walking to the gallows head high, but jaw clenched tight enough to crack. Pastor Crowell faltered mid-sentence, Bible held open in one hand, voice trailing into silence. Luther stopped in the center aisle in full view of everyone. His hands trembled, but he didn't hide them. "I need to speak." Crowell hesitated. The judge, Ransom Baird, was seated in the front pew, arms crossed, a faint smirk blooming like a bruise. "Well," the pastor said, finally closing his Bible, "the Lord welcomes the truth even if it's late in arriving." Luther nodded once, then turned to face the rows of familiar strangers. "You all know me," he began, "or you think you do." No one spoke. "My name's Luther Barridge. I've lived in those mountains since before most of your children were born. Some of you remember Eleanor, and my boy Daniel. You came out to the cabin when we buried them." A flicker of shame moved across a few faces. "Since then I've been a ghost," he continued. "Breathing, chopping wood, fixing fence posts, but a ghost just the same." He took a shaky breath. And then a woman showed up. Annie Mae Coulter, with 3 boys half-starved and frozen half to death. He scanned the room. No one met his eyes. "I didn't ask for them. They didn't ask for me. But the mountain didn't care. It just snowed, and snow doesn't ask your permission to fall." A few people shifted in their pews. She cooked, she cleaned. She taught those boys to read by firelight. I watched a mother give everything she had to keep her children alive in a place that's killed stronger men. He stepped forward once, and I let her leave. The silence thickened. I let the whispers speak louder than I did. I let this town's fear of impropriety outweigh my own damn decency. Baird raised his eyebrows. Pastor Crowell paled. "I don't have the right words," Luther said, "but I've got this." He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded deed. I walked up to the altar and laid it down like a confession. 40 acres signed over to her name. Water access. Usable timber. All legal. She won't need to ask anyone for a place again. Someone near the back gasped. Baird stood up, face tightening. "You can't just sign over land like that without—" "I just did," Luther cut in. Baird took a step forward. "You understand the implications. I understand this town only seems to care when it's time to take something." The room stirred like a pot set to boil. "You preach order," Luther said, voice louder now. "You preach morals. But when that woman came knocking, you offered paperwork and shame." Crowell tried to step in. "Brother, these matters are delicate." "No," Luther said, turning to face him. "They're simple." He turned to the crowd. "You let a woman nearly die in a blizzard with 3 kids because she didn't fit your comfort." He paused. "Well, she fits mine." Gasps now. Someone stood in the far pew, Mrs. Blevins, the baker's widow, gray-haired and sharp-eyed. "She fed my grandson when his folks were too proud to ask," she said. "Brought soup without a word." Another voice from the side: "She helped birth our colt last spring." More murmurs, confused, divided. Baird stepped up beside Crowell, hands out. "This isn't about charity. It's about structure. We can't just—" Luther stepped in toe-to-toe with the judge. "You don't get to decide what's proper when your heart's rotten. You sat warm in your house while a mother nearly froze with your name on her tongue." Baird's mouth opened, but no words came. "You want to chase her out," Luther growled. "You'll have to chase me too." Crowell finally spoke again, voice quieter now. "And what are you to her, Luther? Are you ready to answer that?" A long pause. Then Luther turned to the room and said, plain and steady, I'm the man who finally remembered what it means to stand for someone. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that shamed, it was the kind that weighed truth. He turned without another word, coat flaring behind him, and walked out. No one stopped him. Back at the line shack, Annie was folding the blankets again, hands trembling. The storm had passed, but the sky was thick with overcast gray. The boys were quiet. Too quiet. She didn't want to say the words, but she knew what they were. We need to move again. They couldn't stay. There wasn't enough food, no firewood. The roof leaked. Her sons were coughing. She was already scanning the maps in her head, calculating the hours, the rationing, the risk. She didn't hear the horse until it stopped just outside. She grabbed the rifle. When the door creaked open, Luther stood there, coat dripping with sleet, a paper in one hand. Annie blinked. He stepped in and held it out. It's yours now. She took it slowly. Read it. Read it again. Her knees buckled and she sat hard on the trunk. I signed it, he said. I told them. Told who? The church. The town. Anyone who still thinks they know what's decent. The boys had gathered around, quiet as breath. Annie looked up at him. Why now? His voice cracked. Because I'd rather fight every soul in Ash Hollow than spend one more night knowing you're out here alone. Silence. Then Annie handed the deed to Eli. I walked up to Luther, looked him in the eye. You finally saying what you meant to say all along? He nodded once. Good, she whispered, because I'm done waiting for men to make up their minds. He looked like he'd been slapped. Then she stepped back and opened her arms. He came into them like a man sinking into shore after too long at sea. That night, the fire in the shack glowed bright. Jonah fell asleep in Luther's lap. Micah read out loud, slow and careful. Eli didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. Annie watched them all heart quiet for the first time in weeks. She didn't know what would come next. But she knew this, they were no longer unwanted. They were chosen. And that was the beginning of something she wasn't ready to call love yet. But it felt a lot like a home. The sound of hammering was the first sign things were changing. Luther stood on the roof of the old shack, driving nails through the fresh-cut cedar planks he'd hauled from the cabin that morning. Each strike echoed across the ridge like a drum beat, loud, steady, unignorable. Below, Annie was unpacking crates from the wagon Luther had brought up from Ash Hollow. Canned goods, a kettle, 2 new coats, a stack of books with frayed spines. She moved like someone not used to being helped, and still unsure what to do with kindness that didn't come with a price. Jonah and Micah were inside rearranging the cots with clumsy excitement. Eli stayed out front pretending to carve a stick, but really just keeping an eye on the trail. Too much good could sour fast in a world like theirs. The town hadn't come knocking yet, but it would, and they all knew it. Luther climbed down the ladder shoulders, aching. Annie handed him a cup of coffee, hot, strong, laced with just enough sugar to taste like a promise. You didn't have to do all this, she said. He looked at her. You didn't have to stay. She didn't smile, but her eyes warmed. Someone's got to teach you how to hang curtains. They drank in silence, watching the snow melt in slow patches along the ridge. The sky was clear, but the wind carried news even before the riders did. And the riders were coming. 3 of them, dust trailing behind their horses like smoke from a distant fire. When they reached the clearing, Eli was the first to his feet, stuck forgotten. Company, he called. Luther set his cup down. Annie stepped forward, putting a hand on Jonah's shoulder. The lead rider was Moses Kane. Behind him, two men Annie didn't know, but Luther did: Samuel Reeves, owner of the grain store, and Tate Winslow, the schoolmaster. All three dismounted quiet and slow. Moses spoke first. Figured we'd come see if the rumors were true. Luther crossed his arms. Which ones? That you'd lost your damn mind. Annie flinched, but Luther didn't. He looked Moses in the eye. Then you heard right. Moses laughed, deep, loud, real. Well, hell, that's the first truth I've heard in weeks. The tension cracked just a little. Samuel stepped forward, pulling off his hat. I came to apologize. My boy Micah told me what the lady did for him. I brought him medicine when my wife was sick. I didn't know. Tate nodded. Words going around that she's not what Baird said. She's better, Luther said simply. Annie blinked at that, tightened her grip on Jonah's coat. Moses gestured toward the shack. Are you fixing this place permanently? Luther shrugged. Trying. You need help. Luther hesitated, then nodded once. And just like that, the line began to shift. They worked until sundown. Moses split logs with Micah. Samuel repaired the front step. Tate sat with Jonah and helped him trace letters in the dirt. Annie didn't say much. She watched, studied, waited for the mask to drop for the catch and the kindness. But it didn't come. When night fell, they shared stew in tin bowls and passed around coffee thick as mud. Moses lit a cigar and leaned back against the wagon. You know this isn't over, right? Luther nodded. Baird won't let it go. He's already talking to the county judge, trying to undo the deed. He can't. He'll try. Annie looked between them. Why does it matter so much to him? Moses glanced at her. Because power doesn't like to be ignored. And you made him irrelevant the second you didn't crawl back begging. Annie stared into her bowl. I'm not leaving again. No one's asking you to, Luther said. Moses added, not anymore. Eli stepped outside just then, rifle slung awkwardly over his shoulder. There's smoke. South Ridge. Luther was on his feet instantly. Campfire. Too much. Looks like a burning brush. On purpose. Moses stood. Scouting party. Or warning, Luther muttered. Samuel whistled. Are they trying to burn you out? No, Annie said softly, standing now. They're trying to scare us first. Her face was hard, calm. They want us to run. Jonah pressed his face into her coat. Micah clenched his fists. Eli didn't flinch. Moses looked at Luther. What do you want to do? Luther took a slow breath, then said the words he'd never said out loud before. I want to fight for what I believe is mine, not because I own it, but because I finally deserve it. The men stared at him. Then Moses smiled. Good, he said. About damn time. That night, Luther and Annie sat by the fire while the boys slept. The shack was warmer than it had ever been. Are you scared? She asked. He nodded. Yes. She leaned against his shoulder. Me too. Outside, wind rustled the trees, and somewhere beyond the ridge a torch flared in the dark. Luther watched it through the window, jaw clenched. They were coming. But this time he wouldn't wait behind a door. He would stand in the light. And if Ash Hollow wanted a war, then they'd see what a mountain man could do when he finally stood for something more than ghosts. The fire came at dusk. Annie saw the first thin smoke rising over the ridge, too close, too deliberate. She stood at the edge of the clearing, hand shading her eyes, lips tight. The others were still inside, hammering new braces into the walls, but she didn't call out. She just watched it spread, controlled, measured, like someone was testing the wind. She didn't move until the flames licked the edge of the pine line. Then she turned and shouted, "Fire Ridge Line!" Luther was out the door before she finished. Moses and Samuel scrambled behind him, grabbing shovels, buckets, anything that would hold water. The boys followed, wide-eyed but ready. They'd been taught enough this winter to know when play had no place. They formed a line fast, filled buckets from the creek, passed them up the slope where Luther and Moses were already stomping and shoveling the flame down before it could jump to the roof. Tate rode out for help. The trail to Ash Hollow was slick but fast on a fresh horse. Jonah stayed inside with Annie, her arms wrapped around him tight as he cried. The heat hadn't reached the shack yet, but the sky had turned orange and thick with soot. "Ma," he whispered, "is it going to take us again?" "Baby," she said, "not this time." The wind shifted, smoke blew east, and that saved them. By nightfall, the flames had died down, leaving scorched earth and blackened pine where Beauty used to live. But the shack still stood, the creek still flowed, and no one had been lost. Not yet. Luther stood alone by the tree-lined shirt, soaked with sweat and soot streaked across his jaw. His eyes were locked on the trail southwest toward Ash Hollow. Annie walked up behind him. "That wasn't an accident." "No," he said. "They're trying to scare us off. It won't work." She looked at him. "They'll come harder next time." "I know." She hesitated, then asked, "What happens when they don't stop at fire?" He didn't answer right away. Then soft and certain, "Then I stopped being nice about it." The next day, help came late. Only 4 men from Ash Hollow followed Tate back, and none of them wore a badge. They brought buckets and ashcloth, talked in circles, and said the word accident too many times. Moses didn't hide his anger. "Accident my ass," he muttered. Samuel stayed quiet. He'd seen the pattern of burn. He knew. But the town was afraid, and fear made men small. Annie kept the boys close. Eli sharpened his pocket knife too loudly. Micah stopped laughing altogether. Jonah stopped asking questions. The shack was no longer just a shelter. It was a symbol. And symbols, as Annie knew too well, made for easy targets. 2 nights later, someone left a message. It wasn't a letter, not paint. It was a rabbit. Skinned, hung on the door by its feet. Still warm when Annie found it. Luther took it down with gloved hands and said nothing. Micah cried. Eli asked for the rifle. Annie stared at the wooden frame and felt something in her gut uncoil, slow, tight, dangerous. Later, when the boys were asleep and the others gone, Luther found her sitting by the fire, sharpening a blade. She didn't look up when she said, "They did this to my husband, too." He sat beside her. She continued, slow and quiet. "He filed a claim nobody liked. I worked the land anyway. People spat when they saw us, called me a squatter, called my boys thieves." Her fingers tightened on the whetstone. "He went into the mine one morning, never came back. They said it was a collapse, but I walked those tunnels after, and I didn't see a cave-in. I saw claw marks." Luther didn't breathe. They made it look like an accident, same as this fire. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" She stopped sharpening, because no one wanted to listen. He reached over and took the knife gently from her hands. "They'll listen now," he said. She looked at him, eyes wet but hard. Why now? His voice cracked. Because I'm not letting it happen again. The next morning, a stranger arrived. On foot, cloaked, hooded in gray wool. She walked into the clearing like she owned the trail, eyes scanning every corner. Jonah shouted from the porch, "Ma, someone's coming." Annie stepped outside, rifle slung low. The woman pulled back her hood. Annie went white. "Hello, sister." Everyone frozen. Ma, Micah whispered. Annie didn't speak. Her mouth parted. Her knees almost gave out. Luther stepped forward, hand on his belt. The woman smiled. "Easy. I'm not here to finish what they started." Annie found her voice. "What are you doing here, Cora?" "I heard the fire didn't work. Figured they'd try something worse. So I came to see you while I still could. You shouldn't be here." "I know." The boys stared, confused. Annie shook her head. "I buried you." Cora shrugged. "You buried the name, not the woman." Luther stepped closer. "Who is she?" Annie whispered. "My sister. Cora Coulter. She disappeared 6 years ago." "I disappeared," Cora said, "because Ash Hollow didn't leave me a choice." She turned to the others. "They did to me what they're trying to do to her. But I got out before they burned me too." She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small leather pouch, tossed it onto the porch. Luther opened it. Inside, a map. A deed. A newspaper clipping dated 3 years back, mining widow found dead. No investigation planned. Cora said quietly, "You want proof, you want leverage. There it is. Use it." Annie stared at her sister. "You could have come sooner." "I know. But I was scared." And then, with no more words, Cora turned and disappeared back down the trail. That night, they all gathered around the table. Luther laid the map out flat. "The mine here," he said, pointing, "was the one her husband staked." Samuel nodded. "The town tried to claim it under eminent domain." Moses muttered, "Greedy bastards." "We take this to the judge," Annie said, "and we make them answer." "They won't like it," Tate added. "They don't have to," Luther said. "They just have to hear it." Annie looked at the boys, at the shack, at the scars they were all learning to carry. Then she nodded. "If they want to burn down what we're building, they better bring more than fire." Ash Hollow's courthouse had never been so full. By noon, half the town had gathered in its old cedar-paneled room, sweat and suspicion clinging to the air like humidity. Benches groaned under the weight of heavy coats and heavier opinions. A hush swept through as Luther Barrage pushed the doors open, boots echoing loud as gunshots on the wood floor. Annie followed, shoulders squared, lips drawn into a line. In her hand, the map, the deed, and Cora's newspaper clipping, now creased at the edges, but still legible. Eli walked behind them, eyes fierce. Micah and Jonah stayed behind at Nora's with Tate. Safer that way. At the front, Judge Ransom Baird sat tall in his chair, robes draped over his stiff frame like armor. Next to him stood Mayor Dunley's slick hair, nervous smile, and a notepad he hadn't yet opened. Sheriff Toller leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, chewing a toothpick like he had no stake in anything. But the crowd of farmers, traders, widows, ranchers buzzed with tension. Luther stepped to the center and held up the folder. "This," he said, voice steady, "is proof." Baird didn't move. Of what Annie took a step forward. Of theft. Of coercion. Of murder if you want to split it open far enough. Murmurs rippled. "This map shows the original mining claim," she said, holding it high. "My husband filed it." This deed shows that land was never lawfully transferred. And this clipping she tapped it proves the town ruled his death an accident before they even saw his body. Baird leaned forward, fingers steepled. That's quite an accusation, Mrs. Coulter. It's not an accusation, she snapped. It's a reckoning. Someone in the back clapped once, then stopped. Mayor Dunley cleared his throat. Even if all this is real, what does it have to do with the current dispute? Annie's jaw clenched. Luther stepped in. Because that same land borders the shack she and her boys now live in. Because the same people who tried to erase her husband's name are now threatening to erase hers. And because people in this town helped them do it. Baird's smile was tight. You came here for justice, no, Annie said. We came here for the truth, and to make sure you choke on it. Gasps. Someone cursed under their breath. The sheriff stood straighter. Judge Baird banged the gavel. That's enough, is it, Annie asked. Because I think the people of this town deserve to know who you've been protecting, and what you've been taking from them. A woman stood near the left pew, Mrs. Blevins trembling. My husband died in that same mine. Mine too, a man added. The crowd swelled with voices, rising now, questioning. You said it was natural gas. You said it was too unstable. Why didn't we ever see the books? Baird pounded the gavel again. This is not a trial. But maybe it should be said Moses Kane stepping through the door with Samuel behind him. Maybe it's time we stop pretending you're the only one with power in this room. Baird stood up. You're walking a fine line. Luther's voice cut through the room like a saw. Then maybe you ought to be afraid of what happens when we stop walking in it. Gasps. Mayor Dunley looked from Luther to Annie to the crowd. Sweat gathered at his brow. A vote, he blurted. We should take a vote. Public consensus. Baird turned to him, venom behind his eyes. You want to be governed by a mob now, Dunley said carefully. But I don't want a riot either. The vote was called. 2 questions. 1, should the claim be honored and Annie Mae Coulter's right to the land recognized and protected? 2, should Judge Ransom Baird recuse himself pending investigation into land seizure misconduct? They wrote names on slips of paper, folded them, dropped them in the wooden box that had once been used for church donations. The waiting was unbearable. Outside, the air was heavy with summer rot, even in winter. The kind of tension that lives in droughts and dry lightning. Inside, Annie sat still, hands in her lap, gaze far away. Luther sat beside her, elbows on knees. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Because they both knew this wasn't just about land. It never had been. 30 minutes passed. Then Sheriff Toller stepped out with the count. He handed the slips to Dunley. The mayor read them once. Again. His mouth moved, lips forming numbers. Then he turned. First vote, 72 in favor, 11 against. Applause burst from one side of the room. Cries of joy, relief, anger. Dunley raised a hand. Second vote, 63 in favor of recusal, 20 against. This time the room didn't cheer. It held its breath. Judge Baird stared at the crowd, then at Annie, then at Luther. You've made a mistake, he said, voice low, even. No, Annie replied. We finally corrected one. Baird didn't explode. He didn't shout. He simply walked down the aisle, coat brushing the benches, and disappeared through the back door like a man leaving a funeral that hadn't started yet. Later, Annie stepped out into the pale sun. People came up to her quietly, respectfully. Not all of them, but enough. Hands shook hers. Words were said. Apologies. Thank you. A few tears. Eli stood nearby watching it all, unsmiling but proud. Micah ran into her arms when they got back to Nora's. Jonah clung to her waist like he never meant to let go again. Luther walked behind her carrying nothing, but feeling everything. That night back at the shack, Annie stood by the window while Luther stoked the fire. She hadn't spoken much. Neither had he. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked finally. He paused. "No." She turned. "Then what do we do?" He looked at her. "We stop surviving and start living, even if the wolves are still circling." She exhaled, then walked to him, put her arms around his waist, held tight, and for the first time neither of them pulled away. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the warmth stayed, not from the fire, from the people, from the fight, from the truth that had finally been spoken aloud, too late for some, but just in time for those still breathing. The first sign of trouble was the silence, not the peaceful kind, not the kind that wrapped a place in rest. This silence had teeth. Luther felt it the moment he stepped out of the shack to chop wood. No birds, no breeze, just the brittle stillness of something watching. He scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but something was coming. Inside, Annie was folding laundry when the knock hit the door sharp, fast, like a warning shot. She reached for the rifle before she even stood. Jonah and Micah looked up from the floor. Eli beat her to the door. Standing outside wasn't Baird. It was Cora. And she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a tall man wrapped in a slick black coat collar pulled high, a bowler hat shadowing his eyes. He had the kind of stillness that wasn't natural, measured, quiet, patient, like a wolf on a leash. Annie, Cora said, voice tight. "This is Avery Blackwell. He's the one who funded the mine." Annie's jaw tensed. "I thought Baird owned the deed." "He managed it," Cora said. "But Avery bought the note. The land, the tunnels, everything." Luther stepped forward, squinting. "And now you've come to collect," Avery smiled. Cold, distant. "I came to offer closure." Annie raised the rifle an inch higher. "Most men don't use that word unless they're selling something." Avery's smile didn't budge. "I'm offering you a trade. You walk away. Forget the shack. Forget the claim. I'll pay you $5,000 and see to it that your children are educated in St. Louis. Safe. Far from here." Luther let out a bitter breath. "So you're the real devil, no?" Mr. Barrage, Avery replied, voice like polished steel. "I'm just the man who owns what your pride is now standing on." Cora stepped forward between them. "Don't take it, Annie. You brought him here. I didn't know what he wanted until we got halfway down the trail," she snapped. "I thought he wanted peace. But all he wants is the land back." Avery raised a gloved hand. "Peace can look like a deed, or it can look like a cross. I prefer the former." Annie lowered the rifle, but didn't step back. "I buried my husband because of that mine. I buried my pride after, but I will not bury my boys." "You won't have to," Avery said softly, "if you walk away now." Micah stood behind Annie, fists clenched. "We're not leaving," he said. Avery's eyes flicked to the boy, then back to Annie. "You have until sundown tomorrow." He turned, boots crunching softly, then disappeared into the woods like he'd never been there. Cora lingered. Annie looked at her. "You came all the way out here to betray me. I came to stop you from being blindsided." "I didn't know he'd come too." You always did pick men who could lie better than you. Cora flinched. I stayed away because I was broken, she said quietly. Not because I stopped loving you. Annie didn't reply. Cora left. That night the fire didn't warm much. The boys stayed quiet. Luther barely touched his stew. Annie sat near the window watching shadows shift between the trees. You believe him? Luther asked finally. Yes, she said. The kind of man who threatens children doesn't bluff. Eli put down his spoon. So what do? We don't run, she said. Luther nodded. But we don't wait either, she added. If we're going to keep this land, we fight like it matters. He looked at her across the table. Are you willing to burn it all down? She shook her head. No. I'm willing to build something they can't bury this time. They spent the next day preparing, not for war, for exposure. Luther rode into Ash Hollow with Moses and Tate carrying the full stack of evidence. Cora had brought every contract, every falsified record, every witness statement. Mayor Dunley held a public meeting on the courthouse steps. This time more people came, and this time no one shouted them down. The town listened, because the town was changing. Not all at once, but enough. At sundown, Avery returned, alone. He walked into the clearing like it was his slow hands behind his back, no weapon in sight. Annie stood in the doorway, Luther by her side. The boys in the shadows, silent. Well, Avery asked. Annie held up the deed. The town knows the truth now. You don't own it anymore. Truth, Avery said almost gently. Funny thing, it doesn't change value, only perception. He looked at the shack. You think this little victory means something? It means we're not afraid of you, Luther said. Avery tilted his head. No, you're not afraid yet, but you will be. He turned, started walking away, then paused. By morning, he said, either you're gone or the fire comes back. And then he vanished into the dark. After he left, Annie collapsed onto the porch steps, exhausted. Luther sat beside her. I'll stay up tonight, he said. Just in case. She looked at him. We can't keep doing this. No, he agreed. But we can finish it. She was quiet for a long time, then whispered, I don't want to lose this. You won't, he promised. Not while I'm breathing. And he meant it. Because for the first time in years, Luther Barrage wasn't just surviving the mountain, he was claiming it. The final confrontation begins. Avery returns with fire, and the townspeople must choose sides. A sacrifice is made. Annie and Luther stand together in one final trial to decide what stays, what burns, and what love survives. The fire came before dawn, a red smear against the pine line growing faster than it should. Controlled, intentional. A ring of flame swallowing the edge of the ridge driven by wind, and the quiet kind of hate that men like Avery Blackwell never needed to shout. Luther was already outside when it lit the sky. The boys stirred in their beds, murmuring half awake until Annie's voice rose firm through the cabin. Get your boots. Pack fast. They didn't ask questions, not anymore. Eli grabbed the rifles. Jonah held the deed to the land like it was scripture. Micah moved with a quiet purpose that hadn't been in him months ago. Luther scanned the tree line. He knew how fire traveled, and he knew this one had been set to trap them. They had maybe an hour, 2 if the wind died. But it didn't. It screamed. In town, Moses Kane burst through the mayor's door still in his nightshirt shouting, "It's the Ridge, they lit it." Tate was already on horseback by the time Moses made it to the square. A bell rang, a rusted church bell no one had touched in years. It echoed down Main Street like a call to arms. No one needed to be told what to do. They'd heard the vote. They'd seen the proof. Now they had to choose who they were. And they did. Buckets, blankets, wagons. The town moved, not away, but toward the fire. Annie had the boys load the wagon while she soaked every blanket in the creek. Her hands were raw fingers stiff, but she didn't stop. Luther came back from the edge of the ridge with soot on his face and ash in his hair. "They're closing the loop," he said. "If we don't cut through the south trail, we'll be trapped." She didn't flinch. "Then we go through." He looked at her half in awe. "You never back down." She gave him a tired smile. "I used to. Not anymore." The wagon was ready when the flames broke through the first tree line. Eli drove. Micah and Jonah clung to each other in the back. Luther rode alongside, rifle in hand. Annie sat up front, soaking wet blankets across her lap, eyes locked on the narrow trail ahead. The fire followed like a predator. Ash rained. The trees groaned. Smoke choked every breath. But they didn't stop. Not once. They hit the clearing just as the flames closed the last exit behind them. And then through the smoke, figures. People. The town. Dozens of them lined up in a half circle with wet coats and shovels and soaked cloths and water barrels. Moses waved. "Ride through." "We've got it." Luther didn't think. He just shouted, "Go!" Eli cracked the reins. The horses screamed and bolted through the ring of fire. The wagon bounced hard wood, creaking under pressure. And then cool, wet. Voices shouting, hands grabbing, a wave of water splashing over the wheels, and silence. They were through. Luther jumped off and ran to Annie, pulling her from the wagon seat just as her knees buckled. She coughed hard, then laughed. "They came," she whispered. They did. She looked at the crowd. Some were coughing. Some were crying. All were tired. But none of them had walked away. Avery arrived just after the fire was controlled. He rode up slowly alone again. But this time, no one flinched. No one stepped back. They stepped forward. Mayor Dunley met him first. "You're not welcome here anymore." Avery smiled like it didn't matter. "This isn't your land to say so." Tate held up the county writ signed and sealed just the night before. "Actually, it is. The deed's been validated, and the mine's under investigation." Avery's smile faltered. Luther stepped beside Dunley. "You burned everything you could, and still couldn't erase her." Avery looked at Annie, then at the boys. "Enjoy your ashes," he said softly. Annie stepped forward, voice cold. "You think fire destroys everything. It doesn't. Sometimes it clears the rot so something better can grow." Avery turned, and for the first time in his life, he walked away without winning. The shack burned, but the land didn't. The claim held, and by spring, the town helped rebuild, not just the shack, but a schoolhouse, a mill, a road connecting the old trail to the new ridge. And on the foundation of that burned shack, they laid fresh stone, built a cabin twice the size, with a porch, and a chimney tall enough to be seen from the town square on clear mornings. Luther stayed. Of course he did. Annie didn't ask him to. He didn't need her to. He belonged there. The mountain didn't hold ghosts anymore. It held roots. On a warm morning that May, the town gathered for a meal at the new cabin. Dozens came. Nora brought pies. Samuel grilled meat. Kids ran barefoot through the clearing. Micah read from a book under the tree. Jonah painted with charcoal on the back fence. Eli stood by Luther hammering the frame of a barn they were building by hand. And Annie, she stood on the porch, one hand resting on the railing, watching her town laugh and live and grow. Luther came up beside her. They asked if we'd name the cabin. She looked at him. You pick. He thought for a second. How about Ash Hollow's End? She laughed. You always were dramatic. He smiled. What would you call it? She leaned against him. Home. Because that's what the story had always been about. Not fire, not land, not vengeance, but the idea that a place becomes sacred when people decide it's worth fighting for. And that healing doesn't come when pain disappears. It comes when you choose to stay even after the burn. It comes when you stop running and decide that you are no longer unwanted. You are home.